Dr. Wiesel's Khan 251. Advanced Topics. Excel. Session 4 of 6. Dialog box, user form controls, and Visual Basic for Applications lines. The teaching points of session number 4 are as follows. User form, text box, spin button, one-liner VBA for text boxes and spin buttons, auto open, and startup files and how the VBA viruses work. Last time we said that the file that we saved was version 3 and it's an XLSM with a macro. So this time when we will open the file, we should notice the pop-up of do you really want to open the macro? It should be here, security warning. Remember, we have set this up by going into the security under developer, macro security, and we set it to be disable all macros with notification, which means every time we have macros, they will be disabled unless we say otherwise. We could have set it to enable all macros. If you have a lot of these VBAs working in your computer and you have a good virus checker, you may set this up. So we're going to say under options, enable this content, which means we now have the macros behind the buttons working. So if I click on go to drawing, it should take me there. And we had buttons all over the place. That was your homework. We know how to get to Visual Basic. Alternate F11 takes me there. Or if you don't like working with shortcuts, under developer is Visual Basic. I prefer the shortcuts because they are faster. And we showed last time that we had two modules. Module 1 had actually most of the macros, and Module 2 was just created. We actually emptied it last time, if you remember. You should have by now 3 macros, as I said, with all the buttons copied and set up. Today we'll move into yet another level of Visual Basic or Excel. If you will look at the announcement of project number 1, it says that the interaction with the module will be through a dialog box. I use the term dialog box because it's something that is in my view closer than what Visual Basic uses. Visual Basic uses the term user form for what we want to insert. We have seen so far that under Visual Basic we have Excel objects. These are actually the sheets that we have, and we may also have graphs here in this area. Then we have the modules. Now we will insert yet a third type of Visual Basic. They are still objects, Visual Basic characteristics, and that is the user form. We can either go to insert user form, or there is sometimes a button set up here. Let's go through user form because we don't use it all that often. And what you will notice is that we now have yet another subfolder here called user form. This is the user form that we're seeing. Its characteristics, if you have used the same setting of the Visual Basic for Applications editor windows as we did last time, this is the project viewer and this is the properties. We see here the properties of the user form. Notice that the moment I click on user form, the toolbox appears. Sometimes you will have this toolbox closed or disappearing. If you want to bring it back, you will have to click on this little toolbox button here that makes it appear. If I click on something else, such as modules, notice that the toolbox disappears even though the user form is still selected. So the only way you will see actually the toolbox even if it is enabled, as you should, is by having selected the user form. The user form, it's actually what we will see when we look at the final product. If you have clicked on user form and you will click on this little green button that is run, or you will press the F5 key in Visual Basic. Remember that in regular Excel, F5 was go to. This time is run user form. And when you press this button, the user form is activated, or if you click it on any subroutine, like here, for instance, let's see what happens. If I'm on Excel, I'm in the middle of my calculations. Let's go to input output. That's a sheet that we recognize. And I will go to drawing and press the run. What you will see that happens here is that Excel went over there. So it runs the subroutine, or in this case, it would run our user form. You click it, and it would go to Excel and show the user form. Right now, we have nothing on user form, so we can only click out, and it will take us back to Visual Basic. Depending on where you are in Excel, sometimes this will not go there. There are a number of bugs with the Visual Basic and the macros in 2007. I think Microsoft Excel was in a hurry to push 2007 out. For instance, in PowerPoint, they have completely nixed the possibility to record macros. You can still use Visual Basic if you know how to do it. You can record macros in PowerPoint 2003, and they would run in 2007 as well, but the macro recorder in PowerPoint 2007 is lost, doesn't exist. As well as in Windows Excel, excuse me, in Excel, for instance, in the past you could do, in 2003 and prior, you could catch objects like this and insert them in macros. Now the macro recorder does not grab those objects. You can still write full programs and refer to the objects, like here I have group 1, or here I have rectangle 1, or here I have oval 5 and oval 6. All those are named, like we have the named ranges, and they will work in Visual Basic, but the macro recorder does not capture activities with these objects. It did in the past. Also, 2007 Visual Basic is very slow in dealing with objects of this type. I think either Microsoft is preparing a new generation of interaction, as they did when they moved from Excel version 4 to Excel version 5. Then it became number 6, and then 98, and so on. Or they were in a hurry and somebody in the team just dropped the ball on it. Everything is possible. We will never find out. Coming back to our user form, our goal now is to have the user form contain all the inputs and the outputs, as well as the navigation controls. So we will start with adding a few controls. The controls are similar to the ones that we have seen previously. We have seen buttons before, we have seen labels, we have seen text boxes, drop boxes in Word, as well as in Excel. Right now we will start with the simplest form of a control, and that is a label. A label we will call in this class, in this lecture, this session, we will call the label a dumb label. You will see that in the next session we will make some of the labels, not the ones that we do today, smarter. Right now, before we put the labels in, I still see that here it says user form 1, and we see the name of the user form 1, so there's the same name as here. I will start getting to the habit of changing the names of most of the things that I'm creating. So since I'm going to have only one user form, I'm going to just put my initials, AVW, here, and you will notice when I click enter, the name of the form will change over here. I keep the type of the object that I have so that I know that this is a user form, but I will hit enter while I'm in the name area, and you will see the name changing there. Enter, the name has changed. A similar way, you can change the name of the modules if you want to. Let's say module 2, I say empty, and when I hit enter, the name is changed. The same thing has happened with the sheets. I can change the name of the sheets, but they actually have the name that is seen under Excel. That's the name shown by Excel. Internally, the computer keeps the name of the sheet as it is. We're not going to change the names of the sheets. I actually don't really need this empty module. So if I want to get rid of an empty module, what I would do, I would click on it, right click and say remove the module. And when I remove the module, it asks me whether you want to export what is in there. So do you want to keep the Visual Basic lines and just take them out of this particular project? And I don't want to keep anything, so my answer will be intuitively no, which will make the module go away. Make sure that module number 1 is still there, that contains your Visual Basic macros that we have created previously. Coming back to our user form, we called it user form AVW, your initials, but it still says here user form. So what I'm going to do is change whatever is written here at the top. This area here, it's called the caption of the user form, and it takes by default the name of the user form itself. This is nothing else but whatever is written there, so I'm going to call it Dr. Vizos Crane. And since I'm working on the crane of the CEO, I can say, rather than crane, I can say Dr. Vizos TD 180 crane, and take out the crane from there. Whatever I type, you will see it right away updating in the area. The size of this text box or user form is exactly the size that I see, so I can increase it to whatever size I desire. And you will notice on the background the little dots there. That's a grid, so that the objects that we're going to add in, all these controls that we're going to add in, will default to that grid. It's easy to align them if we have the grid on. The first part of this text box has to mimic what we have over in the input-output area. So it has to have the height of the building, the height of payload, the depth of lift, the safety clearance, the placer, and the rigging. I'm going to do only the first two, the height of building, the payload, excuse me, the height of building, the height of payload, and the payload itself, because there's a little trick there that I want you to see. You will have to do all 6 on your project. And to save me some typing, I copied the height of building, and I'm going to say a label. I'm going to draw the label. Doesn't really matter how big it is right now. And right now it says label. It says label 1. We don't really care about the name of this label. We just make it ours. So it's AVW, so that there's no conflict with other ones. And the important part of the label, it's nothing else but this caption. I would type in here height of building, and when I hit enter, the height of building shows up. You will notice that the properties of the object, of any object, are shown in 2 different ways, either alphabetically or categorized. Categorized, rather than going alphabetic, show the same, exactly the same properties, but rather than in alphabetic order, we start with appearance, with behavior, with font, with miscellaneous, with picture, position, and so on. Sometimes it's easier to get the properties alphabetically. Sometimes it's easier to get them categorized. We will switch between the 2 of them. You'll notice there's a control tip text here. You can type in, let's say, in feet. And this works in a similar fashion as on your web page we had the alternate text. Let's see how it works. Notice that this time it says run macro, and it's not telling me anything about being able to show the text box or the user form. In order to be able to do that, I have to actually click on the user form, and now when you press on it, you will see that user form appears as well. So if I'm only on the label and I click here, will probably not, because I was in a different area. It says run macro. If I click on the user form rather than being in the properties area, now I can actually run the user form. And when I will do that, it brings me to Excel. And notice what happens when I put the mouse on the top of the writing. Exactly on HTML, as in HTML, we now have the tip text. Notice that in the contract that we have, there's nothing about the tip text, so you can put it in there. If you don't put it in there, I cannot actually take points off, since that is not part of the contract. Back to the user form, I will add an additional 2 such labels, and I can do it by retaking the same steps that I have done. This would be height of payload. I could type in here, I can type in there, I made the correction there. I will call this label 2. I will leave the number in so that there's no overlap, AVW. And if I want the control tip text, I just took the same in feet. And I said that you will have to do all 6. I'm just going to add the payload itself for a reason that will be clearer later on. Now I will show you an additional way of creating the label. I will minimize it a little bit. I can copy and paste. When I copy and paste the label takes the next available number. I will put it a little lower so to remind you that we need to have 6 of those. This will be, again, AVW, and this time this is going to be, rather than height of payload, just payload itself. And then I'm going to say here weight of object to be lifted in pounds. When I copy when I copy a label or any object from one to another, all the common properties stay the same. So if you will look at categorize this time, and I'm going to go to the size, height and width, height and width of payload, as well as of height of payload, they stay the same. An easier way to see that is if I press Shift while I'm selecting the second object. Now the only thing that I'm shown is their common properties. So if I want to align these 3 labels, I would control click on the second and the third. That allows me to select a number of them. Notice that their height is the same, everything else is different. I can either right click on it and say align to the left, as you do in PowerPoint, or make the same size, the same height. And what you notice is that the height is now the same, the left is the same. And I can make the same width as well. So when I will do the same width, notice what happens here. It's taking to the highest number. I can actually start and lower them all. And what I'm doing in effect is changing the size here. I'm going to make the height, let's say, 15 points. I will make the left, let's say, 10 points. And I will make the width, let's say, apparently 70 is going to be enough. If not, you can set it to anything you want. It doesn't really matter what is the size, as long as you understand how you can play with these properties. As I said in this lecture, I will call the labels dumb labels. We will use smart labels in the next session. You will have to add labels for the outputs as well: distance from crane to building, radius of lifting, and length of boom, and so on. So you will have a total of 6 inputs and 5 outputs. Right now, we will just have the labels for them. And today we will only deal with the inputs. I strongly recommend not to go ahead and use what I'm teaching today for the outputs. I will show what the problem is only in the next lecture. Right now, your goal is going to be to create just the inputs. And we're going to create the first input. The first input is going to be a text box. So I'm clicking on the text box under Controls, and I'm going to draw a text box. The size of it is going to be clear only later on when we decide how big it is and how we beautify this user form. So I'm making something that I think is the right size and release it. The property of the text box, first of all, its name is textbox1. This time, since I can give it some other meaning, I can delete the 1 and call this text box height of building. Well, as you will notice, as you will learn later, the text box is going to be actually linked to whatever value I have in the Excel range or cell that I named height of building. So what I will do is I will name this box, I will leave the name text box, I will put an underscore, and I will put in the name of the range to which this makes the link. So in my case, it's height of building, age underscore building underscore AW, and when I will hit enter, that name change takes place. I see it because it happens there. And I can also add control tip text, but this is not relevant here. What is relevant is if I go to alphabetic, because it's easier to see rather than going to categorize all the way down to data, there is something which is called a control source. We will come back to this control source many times in the rest of the semester. The control source is where does the value that the user puts in here as a text, where does it go? And where we want this to go is actually the range that we named age building AVW. So I'm going to actually paste it. I can also type it. Whenever I type, I make mistakes, so that's why I prefer to paste. And it takes effect only either when I move out of this little box here or when I hit enter. So if I click somewhere else, this is where it takes effect. You notice that the number 30 already showed up in my box. I can format it differently if I want to. I can go to font and change the font. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to leave it as it is right now. But from what I see right now is that I can make this box a little smaller, and we're going to do some beautification later on. The same variables that we had before apply here. So remember that the height of building here, the DOM label, if I go to categorized and I'm looking at position, it said that the height of this is 15. I may want to make this height 15 as well. So if I want the text box to be 15, I will just type in 15, and there it is. If I want the two of them aligned, I can right click and align the tops or the bottoms or the middles. Since they are the same, it is the same. And align the bottoms, and now the two objects are aligned. Notice that the height of building, the alignment of the text is actually at the top of the label, where here we have it in the middle. I will let you figure out how can you change that alignment. And I'm going to come back here, and we will start seeing already some interaction. I'm going to do the same for the height of payload. And what I'm going to do is, in order to keep the same size, I can copy and paste. That will add a problem with my control source, or I can add another text box here, and this is going to be called the text box for the height of payload. So I'm taking out the number 1 since I didn't use it. Excel still tries to use that number 1 and then 2 and 3 and 4. And the control source is going to be the same. And notice that when I will go out of this point, let's say clicking under the name again, the height of payload is going to appear here. I'm clicking out, click, and the 12 appeared there. I can select the two text boxes, right click, and then make the same size by width and by height, or I can go down to categorized, go down to position, and I see that their height and their width is the same. So is their left. The top is not, because one top is 12, the other top is 36 as we start coming down. Now we're ready to see how this text box starts working. I'm going to click on see how it looks, and I have here 30 and I have here 12. So what I will do is I will change the number to say 26. And you notice that it's not changing. The only time it will change is, as it happened in Visual Basic, whenever I hit enter or I click out. I'm going to click out on the 12 here. Notice that the 26 is going to go in its place and everything else changes. If I want to make this 10 and either I hit enter, I'm going to hit enter right now. Notice that this number is going to be to 10, to change to 10. The radius of lifting, the length of boom, and accordingly the maximum allowable payload are going to change as well. Hit enter, 10 has changed, everything else has changed, and it goes to the next box. I'm going to close the dialog box, go back to it, and I have double clicked by mistake on it, and it says user form click. Any type of subroutine that has no commands in it, you can safely delete it because it has no action, no effect. We will start learning some of these Visual Basic programs in a few moments. So I'm ready to add yet one other text box, and you will have 6 of these. This time I'm doing the control paste thing. When I control paste, note that the control source stay the same, and that is wrong. This one is going to be the control source for payload, which is here. So control source is payload, and the name of the text box is payload underscore AW as well. This is some movement towards where we want to be, but if you will look in Excel and in any other program that you're used to, let's say if I go to print, file, it goes from here, print. Notice how the interface in printing, let's say number of copies, is a number that you can change. This is the text box. And then there's a little spin button there that allows you to move up or down. Well, I want one of those in my interface as well. So for that, I'm going to add the spin button. And the spin button, this is the scroll bar. Notice if you look closely, the first one that looks like a spin button actually has a little bit of a distance between them. The second one is the spin button. I like to call them spinners. And they go the same way, but they have some more intelligence than just your plain text boxes. Let's see how does it work. I click on spin button, and now 2 things will happen. If I start and I drag downwards first and then to the right, then my spin button is going to be vertical. I'm going to delete it. If I take a spin button and start moving to the right and then down, now my spin button is horizontal. There is a way to change that, but it's easier to make it right the first time. If you want to change the orientation of your spin button, you would go to the property orientation. Anything you can do with any of these objects goes with one of the properties. So with the orientation, and right now it's auto, which means which way I go, you can make it a vertical orientation, and now you see the buttons going up and down, or you can make it horizontal orientation, and now they go left and right, or you can make it auto, and then it keeps it the way it was before. I'm going to delete the object and now start really inserting the first spinner. And my first spinner is going to be about the size of my box. There it is. The spin button will have the same control source as my text box. So I can either click on the text box and take the control source from there. I copied it, and this will be underscore V, and its control source is going to be control V. So I have a text box, I have a control source. They will have the same height. If I want to see where the height is, it's probably easier to go to categorize, because I know it's going to be at the end, and the height of the text box is 18. Why, if you remember the height of my, excuse me, the spinner is 18. If you remember, the height of the is the same, so we matched it because they lock to the grid. If I want all these to be aligned, I will just go to, say, make them the same size, align them to the top, and now we start having things that behave exactly as we want them to behave. Let's see what does this do. So I'm going to activate again my Dropbox, and we saw previously that if I delete and I put number 2 here, nothing happens until I actually click out. That I don't like. I want to change that. And now I will try this spin button. 1, 2, I click 3 times, and still nothing happens. Now you will notice that when I will click somewhere else, the value 22 will change to 25 because I clicked up 3 times. So I'm clicking now on number 10. Notice how it changed to 25. Well, that's a little counterintuitive. It doesn't work the way I want it to do. So I will need to go and make these controls act the way I imagine them to act. And for that, I need to go and start writing lines of Visual Basic. I have stopped the recording for a moment and added another spin button here. And before we go and start adding the Visual Basic lines, I just want to point out something that you will notice when you try to add the spinner for the payload. So I'm going to add a spinner. I'm going to actually try to copy and paste an existing spinner so they have the same size. And this will have to do with the payload. And you will see this only at the payload. You'll see in a moment why. So its name is going to be, rather than spin button, is going to be spin button underscore payload. It's no problem. The problem that you will see is when you try to add the control source. I'm going to paste the control source and hit enter, and it says that it could not set the control source property. That's because you have an invalid property value, and it doesn't really make too much sense other than to the people at Microsoft. The reason here is that there's a property of each of the text buttons, which is their maximum value. And if you go to categorized and you go all the way down to the bottom, so under categorize all the way to the bottom, you will see that under scrolling, the default maximum value of the spinner is 100. Yet right now what we're trying to do is to place a control that raises the value to 5,000. Since that is not possible, we'll actually use a different number there, and the number we're going to use has to do with the maximum capacity of the crane. There's no need to have any higher than that. So in my case, I can now go to the load chart. In my case, the maximum capacity of the crane is 36,000. So I'm going to come here and under categorized on the spinner of the payload, I'm going to put 36,000. And now when I go back to alphabetic and change the control source or type in a control source, you will see that that control source is taken without any problem because I allow the spinner to go that high. Since we looked at the scroll buttons, it doesn't make too much sense to change the payload by 1 pound every time you push on the button. I will use at the small change, let's say 100 pounds. For larger cranes, you may use 500 pounds. It's up to you what you use there. 1 is probably not a good number. That's all I'm saying. So we're back now to the problem that we're trying to solve, that these objects are not responding instantaneously, and we said we need to do something for them to do that. And what we will do is we will write a Visual Basic program. This will be our first line of Visual Basic. That's why they're called one-liners. Behind each of these little controls, they are Visual Basic objects. If you double click on any of them, and you will end up double clicking on each of them. So I'm double clicking on the text box, click, click. You will notice that what Visual Basic did, it opened a new window, and it says here text box height of building AVW, and it says private. We didn't have this word before. We have a sub and an end sub as we did in macro. The private here has nothing to do with a military rank of private sergeant or general. This is like private property, and it means that this particular subroutine that we're going to write is only available when the user form, the dialog box, is active. No other program can actually reach into this without activating first the dialog box. Now, don't follow what I'm doing, just watch right now. By default, the name of the subroutine that we're writing is the name of the text box, in my case, text box height of building or age building AVW, followed by an underscore and change. This is when we decide, or Excel decided, that what we want to do is to run this subroutine whenever there's a change in the value of this text box. And there are other possibilities here. For instance, when we double click on that text box, or when we press enter on where we leave it. The one that is most interesting is the mouse up. You will start noticing that anything we do in Windows actually happens on mouse up. For instance, if I'm going back to my user form and I try to activate it, as we saw here with the button, it says run the user form. If I click on it, nothing really happens yet. I click the button and I hold it down. If I move away and release the button, nothing happens. The form has not been run or activated. It only happens, and try it with me, when I click and then I release the button just above, release the mouse just above that button. So now I'm releasing it, and that's when I moved over. Going back to understand what we're doing, click, click will take me to the same place. Unfortunately, and it's not by mistake, I have double clicked on the user form, so it created a new subroutine saying, when you click on the user form, what do you want to happen? And I don't want anything to happen, so I can either leave it here because nothing will happen, or safely delete this this routine or subroutine because I clicked on it by mistake. I can close this window anytime I want and then go back on my text box, the text box height of building, click, click, will take me exactly to that subroutine that has been created first. To make it easier to read, we start in the subroutines, we start every line with a tab. We intend them so that we see where it starts and where it ends. That way it's easy to see that you're not actually inserting any copy and paste anywhere else. Now the subroutine that we're gonna use, you need to learn it from somewhere, so I'm helping you out here. If you go to today's announcement, and you will follow the VBA notes at the end of the announcements here under support. I open it in a new window. We will talk about the auto open a little later. The one that we're interested in is the one that says edit box, and we have here the name of the macro, and it says range, name of range like height of building dot value equals name of edit box that dot value. You can come back to this. I will try to explain it to you after I write it down in Visual Basic so that you can understand how it works. You're always welcome to to come back to this. You have it in the hyperlink here under VBA notes if you want to revisit it. So I'm back into Visual Basic, and if you remember, the first thing that I said there was range. Well, there's a little trick. If you hold down the control button and press the spacebar, then Visual Basic starts telling you all the different commands that you can give at that moment to Visual Basic. And the name that I want is range. You can see it already appearing as I typed R. Notice how they have different shape in front of them. This little flying box means that is actually an action. It's like another subroutine or a function or something. This here, it's a window with a finger pointing to it, and that means that this is actually an object, and the object is a range or a property of the object. So it's range. And now, if you notice in the syntax, we have open parenthesis and quote marks. So open parenthesis and quote marks. The reason I have, and this now works like a function in Excel, as I showed last time, the reason we have the range in quote marks is that anything that is not in quote marks, it is treated as a variable. So it would look at what is written in that variable that I have. Well, the quote mark, the range that I want to use, right, is this one here, height of building. I can copy it either from Excel, I can copy it from the control source, and that's probably the best, the control source of my object. Copy, it's exactly the same because I use the same, and I'm going to paste it, close parenthesis, close quote mark, close parenthesis, dot, and now it's a different thing. So what do you want to do with this range? And again, everything that Excel knows about ranges in general is written over here. What I want is its value. So I clicked V and immediately value comes up. Click, equals. And now it's actually, if you look at the Visual Basic here, it is the name of the edit box. So it's the name of this very edit box that I'm working on. It's going to be a text box. I can either copy its name from here, or I can do again control space bar, start typing text box. And as I did that, you notice that the text box the name of the text box shows up here. This is the property. This here underneath, which is the flying box, text box title building AV change, that is actually the subroutine that I'm working on. It's already recognized by Visual Basic as a valid subroutine. So I'm going to select this time the value from here, click, and then dot value again. We have written our first Visual Basic line. Let's read it together. Remember that it goes from the back to the front, and it says, take the value. So when there's a change, when there's a change in the value of this text box, that's the text box building change, take the value that is in the text box and put it as a value in the range height of building AVW. Well, if that's true, then it should start working here. So I'm going to run it. And you notice that this time, if I move it away, the moment I will delete the number 5, I put a backspace on 5, number 2 changes there. I still have not, in my homework, dealt with the errors. Yours should not give any error. And I put number 22 there, and I type in the 2, that takes care of it. If I press the button, let's say upwards again, 1, 2, 3, again nothing happens because there is no one-liner behind the spinner. I click out, that is happening. So now I will need to add the one-liner to the spinner. And I can either close this window, or if I didn't close it, I can just double click on the spinner, click, and that will add yet another one of those subroutines. The subroutine here is going to be similar. I recommend not to copy and paste because you will get easily confused if you just copy the same one and then change, because that's all it is. We keep the range and we change the object from text box to the spin button. All the subroutines in this area, which is the private area of our text box, are set in alphabetic order. So spin is behind text, and then spin button underscore A is going to be before spin button underscore age. Tab. Now, since I'm on the spin button, remember that what I'm really interested in here is the control source. So I'm copying the control source because I'm going to need it. And I'm going to start, I did a tab first, and I'm going to do the control tab and say range. Click, click, open parenthesis, open quote mark, paste, close value, equals, I take the name of the spin button that I am, and I'm on the spin button because I double clicked on it, so the spin button is selected, hence conveniently its property is there. And I didn't copy, so it's Control C, Control V dot value. And I'm done with my second liner, one liner. So this means that when I will activate my control source, my dialog box, this time, let's try again. I will take it down to 2. When I start clicking up, you notice that it continues from there. If for some reason this is not happening, it means that you are missing the one liner behind your control. For the next time we meet, you will have to have 6 of these. I only created 1 fully and 2 partially. You will have the height of building, the height of payload, the depth of lead, the safety clearance, the payload, and the rigging all set together. And they will all be working with the one liner in Visual Basic. You will also have the DOM labels for distance from crane to building, radius of lifting, length of boom, maximum allowable payload, any indication if the lift is possible or not over here, but nothing next to them. Don't use the text boxes as outputs because they will wipe out. I will show this next time. They will actually wipe out your link to the formula the moment you use them the first time. Going back to the problem we're trying to solve. We were asked to have a dialog box that should appear automatically when the file is open and should contain at least. So we're going to work on the open automatically. In Windows, unless we set in Excel 2007, unless we set the security to low, there is no way for this to happen. I'm going to still show you how it works. And that has to do with security. But once we set this, we set the security to mid-level and say run the macros, we should be able to see this dialog box, this one here, popping up at the beginning of the program. We will also, at the same time, we will decide where do we want to start actually the user, and I suggest that we start the user at the drawing. Okay, so they see what is the lift, and then we will have on the drawing the dialog box which will explain to the user what needs to be done. For that to happen, we will have to write a special type of macro, and there's a special name, it's a reserved name, it's called auto open. I refer to it in the Visual Basic notes, and that is over here at the beginning. This is the auto open, and you'll see how it works. You'll see that it starts with auto open, and then it says first select a sheet. Well, that is the same command as we have in our module. This is the select a sheet. This is where we tell to Visual Basic what sheet do we want the user to go. We will not do that today because while we are still doing the development, that's going to be in our way. What we want is to have this macro that brings up the dialog box automatically for us. So the second line of it is going to be the name of the dialog box, period, and then or dot, the way it's said in computer language, dot show, which means show me the dialog box. That's all it is. You read it backwards and it gives you exactly what you need. So we will start actually from Excel by going to developer, record new macro, and this is going to be called auto with capital A underscore capital O open. And we're going to use Control M like menu for it. Okay. And the reason we're starting it from here is for nothing else but to add this shortcut key that makes our life easier. We say OK, and we can stop recording right away. We have just created an empty shell for this macro. We can now go back to Visual Basic. It was put, the macro was put in module number 2. That is not unexpected. Every time we said that every time you are opening the file again, all the macros go in a new module. As we said, we can move it to module number 1 if you want. And I'm going to do that. Control X, make sure you don't copy, you actually move. So Control X cuts. And I'm going to put it right at the beginning of my module 1. It doesn't matter where it is alphabetically. Visual Basic doesn't really care. So now I'm ready to insert the 2 commands that I need. One is to go to the drawing sheet, and I just copy and paste that command. I don't want this command though to be active. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put a quote mark in front of it, which means now it is completely ignored. And I'm going to put a note to self, disable and enable. Next command before submitting project. And the way I do this so that I can see them well is I will put stars, everything with commas. Excuse me, with quote mark, which means they are ignored by Visual Basic. And then before submitting, we will just take these out, the comments. We will take the quote mark out, and the moment I take the quote mark out, that actually becomes, from a remark, it becomes a command. And we said that the command we're talking about starts with a tab, right? It's the name of the dialog box. Now, I can either come here and take the name of the dialog box, that's one way, or I can do Control Space and user form will bring up the user form. Notice that there are 2, again, this is a new image that we have. The user form, it's a type of object that we haven't seen before. We have seen the properties, we have seen the little flying boxes, which we said are different properties, and then these are further underlying properties. So user form avw dot, you type s, age, and show will show up, and that's all it is to it. Let's see what happens. Now I don't even need to have the run the macro anymore, or run the dialog box anymore. If I'm on the input-output sheet or any other sheet and I do Control M, you would expect it to run. However, this is another little bug that Visual Basic for Application has in Excel 2007. Since we moved the auto open from one module to another, Visual Basic lost track of what is the shortcut key. So I will need to go back to macros, auto open, options, and put back the shortcut key to it. And now when I do Control M, it shows up. As I said last time, the fact that it's written here Control M has no bearing on what the subroutine actually does. So Control M. Now I have all my buttons working. Up and down. And I can take it away and do the interaction with it. Next time, we're going to work on the outputs as well as adding the controls, the buttons on the user form. Right now, we're ready to save. File, save as. This time, this is going to be version number 4 on the desktop, and I want you to see what happens with the auto open. So I'm going to close Excel. When I did that, Excel Visual Basic went to it as well. You can save it from the Visual Basic as well. I prefer to save it from Excel so I know what I have just saved. And this is version 4. When I open it, it will show up with the button saying you have macros there. Do you want to enable them? This is the part that we didn't take the risk of going to developer and saying don't ask. And then we say enable the content, and so when I say OK, the first thing that will happen is that this macro that is called auto open will run. There's a way actually to add viruses to this, and then the way people add viruses is exactly this. They put the macro in, they do one that is called auto open, and then they take over whatever happens in the background. This is how viruses are created. You can then hide them from the user so the user doesn't even know that in the background a lot of things are happening. One more thing before we close for today, and that is you notice that when we go to developer and we go to record macro, there is a place that we didn't talk about, and that is where the macro goes. Right now we stored it in this workbook. There's a possibility to create a personal macro workbook or put it in the new workbook. Depending on what you want to do with the macro, I'm not going to go too deep into this, but you can have your own personal set of macros which you open, and then they will transfer to other files as well. Of course, particular names such as we gave now have to be found in the sheet that you are working with. So that takes a little more knowledge that we have right now. And we can put it in a new workbook. Excel has an area where they would put the add-ins and templates so that every worksheet that you open new would have those particular macros that can be done in Word as well. And in PowerPoint, for a matter of fact, except that, as I said, PowerPoint doesn't have the macro recorder. Again, you should have 6 DOM labels and 5 DOM labels here, nothing on the outputs, and all these buttons should work for next time, as well as the error correction should be ready. This being said, we have come to the conclusion of this lecture. We will see you next time.